I'm Lenny Sorensen, and today we are going to look at what it takes to make chocolate. And to make chocolate, we want to go back to the very distant past, but one of the things that we want to look at is the records of what everybody thought when what the Europeans thought when they first encountered this miraculous, addicting, mysterious foodstuff. And so the Aztecs, they drank their chocolate really dark and really bitter and very strangely flavored compared to what Europeans were used to. And so when we read in the Florentine Codex from 1590, not that long after the Europeans encountered chocolate, we're warned because chocolate is this strange and mysterious ingredient. Nobody knows quite, is it an aphrodisiac? Does it cure disease? Does it make you crazy? What happens? And so the monk, Bernardino de Sahagún, he says, green cacao makes one drunk, takes effect on one, makes one dizzy, confuses one, makes one sick, deranges one. When an ordinary amount is drunk, it gladdens one, refreshes one, consoles one, invigorates one. And thus it is said, I take cacao, I wet my lips, I refresh myself. Now actually that seems pretty ambivalent to me between whether it makes you really crazy or it really is actually something that makes you feel really good. And since we tend in the modern world to think that chocolate makes everything perfect and wonderful, that's the tack that we're going to take. And so let's look at what goes into and what did go into the making of chocolate. You have first the actual chocolate nibs. They had to ferment the beans and crush them and go through various processes, which are part of another part of this story. But once they had that ready to go, then this ancient technology, the same thing used to make masa for tortillas and masa for tamales, was the metate and the mano. And you had to literally grind it by hand. You had to make it on a heated surface. Now, the Aztecs didn't just make one little bit at a time. They were making it for whole banquets and dinners and for the king. And so they would have in the kitchens probably rows of metates like this and rows of women grinding the chocolate to make it ready for the ceremonies. So here you have your chocolate. You're going to add flavorings, and the flavorings that the Aztecs had available to them, and I forgot to bring the honey, but there was honey that they would use to sweeten, is first, let's say, annatto. Annatto is a red herb that comes from Brazil, and it was used as because of its coloring. When you mash it up, it makes things red, and so you can make drinks, you can make paint, face paint. It helps keep the mosquitoes away, it said, but it's very decorative. They even use it to paint pottery, and it's used in the chocolate making to add a nice rich color. So we're going to add the annatto, which was part of the process. You had vanilla. Vanilla has gotten very expensive, but vanilla comes from a bean that grows on a vine, comes originally from the northern Amazon basin, was fertilized by a very special kind of bee, the Melipona bee, which is one of the reasons it's been so very difficult to grow vanilla in other places, because without the bee you have to hand pollinate the vanilla pretty difficult. And it grows on a vine that will grow 350 feet tall. So it's an endeavor to do it. And yet for several thousand years, it was highly prized as a flavoring, and of course we all love it a great deal. And so we're going to put a little of our vanilla bean in there. As you can see, the place where the chocolate was being made would have been a very noisy place, very hot, full of hot areas where these spices could be warmed first, and the metates would be warmed, and everybody was hot and working at it. So we've got our vanilla, we have our annatto, and we're going to add next our allspice. And allspice comes from the Caribbean islands as well. And they called it allspice. This is a European name, of course. Allspice because it seemed to resemble the flavor of many of the spices that the Europeans were looking for. Remember, that's one of the things that they came to the New World. They wanted to find more spices because they had all these spices from the Far East, and those things made a lot of money, and if they could find, well, the closest they actually came was allspice. It's really quite tasty and lovely, and we're going to put some of it in here. Now, as almost anybody who has ever eaten any food from south of the American border knows, the chili is an extremely important part of the diet of, for thousands of years in Mesoamerica and South America. And so with these chilies, it added a really lovely bite to the chocolate. That isn't something that we usually think of when we think of chocolate, to have that sharp heat in there. But they wanted a dish that was a drink that really had a lot of powerful punch to it. And so here we go with our chiles, which is a plant that originated again in the upper Amazon basin and lower plateau mountains of Peru, and then were brought probably by birds and other animals as seeds into Central America on the flight lines that come through those places, and then into the areas that we call Mesoamerica. So they are deeply ancient lineage and used, of course, in many, many kinds of cookery. But the idea of mixing it in chocolate kind of takes us aback. So here we go. I just wish you could smell what is already coming from here. This mixture of the spices and the chocolate nibs. I'm going to add a little bit more of that. The Aztecs wanted to drink their chocolate in many kinds of thicknesses and textures as well. So you had, there was a Mexican drink called atole, which is made from very, very finely ground of the very softest of cornmeals, mixed with water into a drink. Well, they also would mix that with their chocolate drink to make a kind of a thick textured drink. And one of the ways that they also made it thick was by adding pumpkin seed and squash seeds, which were a very basic staple in the diet for many kinds of Mexican cookery, and particularly in making, you could use it in making chocolate as well. when it was ready, when it was smooth, when it was ready to mix with the water, then it would be mixed with water and cooked in a vessel to make it very hot, and then using a tool. This is a very big and dramatic molinillo, but usually they're small ones. And sometimes people have seen these when they have gone places in Mexico, and they're for stirring. So you can imagine how in a big vessel, a big deep vessel, you would do this, and this would stir it up and make it very frothy. And that was part of the art, making it nice and frothy on the top. Or if it was in a smaller cup, these are both baked clay vessels from the Caribbean, so there probably would have been something like that available. Again, in a small cup, you could stir that up and make it frothy and ready to pour. There were specialized women who specialized in presenting the chocolate to the king. And typically, from the pictures that we see of the era, the king and his courtiers would have been sitting kind of on floor level while to eat off of small tables. They would, she would bring in the pitcher of the chocolate, and she would have learned and practiced how to pour from way up, for her standing, and he's sitting, and the cup would have been down, and she would have learned how to pour the chocolate directly into the pot without making any misses. And of course that would make it very foamy, as you can imagine that it would do, and be very, very dramatic. So the Aztecs prized it. They used many ingredients that came out of their own culinary culture, things that they ate in other kinds of forms that are equally interesting and complex and delicious. But they also used the tools, these ancient tools that were part of the deepest part of their cuisine, which was the grinding of corn. So they figured out, what a great tool this metate en mano were. And we're going to start with the very notion of all that very intoxicating drink that I gave you that quote of earlier, that can make you, how does he say, can make you drunk, or confuse one, or derange one, or gladden one, or refresh one, or console one. So that's what the Europeans wanted to, that's what they saw it as potentially doing. So they had to use the same method. They didn't have any other technology. This was the technology well through the 2/3 of the way through the 18th century. If you wanted chocolate, it had to be ground this way. No matter where it was made, in whatever combination, by whoever it was, by enslaved people, by native people, by people in a factory trying to produce it. Europeans and Americans in the colonies ordered it in large amounts by the pound, chocolate ready-made. So it was extremely popular, and it began to be, and it came to them in ways that had now been adapted in Europe, because it was first taken to Europe. And so the Spanish liked that kind of bite to the back of the chocolate, the chili bite, but they hadn't really started growing chilies yet. So what were they going to add? They start adding things like black pepper, pepper negra from the Spice Islands. So you can see that they already are taking one ingredient from the New World, far across the Atlantic, and adding to it now spices from far away from their native place of Mexico, of Spain and Europe, adding more exotic spices, somewhat to add a kind of a new flavor profile, and others to imitate some of the parts that they really liked. And so you had your pepper negra that came from Java, Sumatra. You had cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon. They wanted that flavor. That it was an extremely popular spice that just added a flavor that everybody in Europe really, really loved and added to all kinds of things, meat dishes, egg dishes, along with fruits and other kinds of things that we think of as typical. It was very common. So and again, the fragrance is already starting to really come. One of the newer, more attractive and fascinating spices that began to be common in the 17th century was the nutmeg. And it was, again, it came from the Moluccas. It was the only place it grew. There's only one other place in the New World that it grows, and that's Grenada. It's a difficult tree to cultivate out of its native climatic needs, but we all love it. It seems to be one of the more popular of the spices, and it's the spice, of course, most associated with something like eggnog. Well, it's divine in chocolate too. And, so you can see they're adding punches of flavor that begin to replicate what they tasted when they were first introduced to chocolate in Mexico. But they wanted something else, partly because they had debates about, is chocolate safe for women to drink? If it's an aphrodisiac, maybe not. Could the ill drink it? Is it too powerful for people? Does it upset the humors, the four humors? Is that a problem? Is it, how do we want to present this? Is it a medicine? People were always looking for medicines because there were a lot of illnesses, and they always tried to see first with almost any new botanical, is this a medicine? Because that was so important. Once they discovered it wasn't a medicine, and that it probably wasn't really an aphrodisiac, and it really didn't make you crazy, well then maybe women can drink it too. Wouldn't that be nice? And what do we think of when we think of women's drinks? Is sugar, which of course by the middle of the 16th century was beginning to be very, very commonly available from not only the New World slave plantations, but had been available for easily 100 years in the Mediterranean basin as refined sugar. So to make everything sweet, well, they didn't use that Melipona pollinated honeys. They used sugar. And that's what we're going to add, make it sweet. So this chocolate has begun to be sweet. It's got the pepper edge to it, nice little thing. It's got that nutmeg kick on the back of the throat. It's got the cinnamon sweetness. It's got that sugar to add. What more might, people loved a lot of flavors, and you'd be amazed when you see recipes of the medieval period when people had, lots and lots of different spices combined in ways that we don't usually do today. But there's two that often were very, very favored. One of them was anise, and that's that licorice flavor that I don't care for too much, but a lot of people really love. And so I'm going to add a little bit to be good, but not too much. There we go. Because that adds a very complex, and that's a very European thing to add. the anise is part of cookies in Scandinavia. It's part of savories and sweets in Spain and France. It's a very Mediterranean kind of taste, and so they were going to add. So they had a little bit of their own cultural stuff. But the last thing that I'm going to add here would really have come primarily from the Moorish influence in Spain, and that's the oranges. This is dried orange peel, and so the flavor of the orange would just add a very unique spin to this very New World flavor combination. So we've got so we have what the Europeans designed, and the last thing that we're not going to add today, but would have been the last thing that got added to this delicious concoction was milk, the very idea. And with the addition of milk, then within the notion of who was proper to drink this drink, it became very proper for not only women, but for children. And so today we really think of, we think of hot chocolate for children as a treat, and it's lovely. But there was a time when people were really worried that chocolate might be inebriating and intoxicating and deranging if they experimented with it.